In this episode, we are going to take some of the most common network tools and make them feel practical instead of intimidating. New learners sometimes see a list of tools and think the main goal is to memorize what each one looks like, but that is not really the skill that matters most. The more useful skill is knowing what question the technician is trying to answer before picking up the tool. A crimper, a tester, a loopback plug, or a tap is not just a piece of gear sitting in a bag. Each one helps confirm something, rule something out, or narrow the problem to a smaller part of the network path. Once you understand that idea, the tools stop feeling like random objects and start feeling like ways to test a theory. That is exactly how beginners start thinking more like technicians, because good support is often about proving what the problem is not before deciding what the problem probably is. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A very helpful starting point is to remember that network tools are usually chosen based on the kind of failure the user describes. If the complaint is that a new cable does not work, the technician may need a tool that checks cable quality or cable termination. If the complaint is that a network port seems dead, the technician may need a way to test whether the device, the port, or the cable is the real problem. If the complaint is that traffic is behaving strangely even though the physical connection looks normal, the technician may need a tool that gives a closer view of what is happening on the line. That is why beginners should avoid the habit of grabbing a tool just because it is nearby or because it sounds impressive. The better approach is to ask a plain question first. Am I trying to build something, verify something, isolate something, or observe something? Once that is clear, the right tool becomes much easier to choose, and support becomes much less random. A crimper is one of the easiest tools to understand because its job is closely tied to making or repairing network cables. When a technician attaches a connector to the end of a cable, the crimper helps press the connector pins into place so the conductors inside the cable make proper contact. In beginner terms, it helps turn loose cable ends and a connector into a usable cable assembly. This matters because a cable may look fine from the outside and still fail if the connector was attached poorly, if the wire order is wrong, or if the connection between the pins and the internal wires is weak. A technician chooses a crimper when the goal is to create a cable, re-terminate a damaged cable end, or repair a cable that is suspected of failing at the connector. The question behind that choice is simple. Is the physical cable ending likely to be the problem? And do I need to build or rebuild it correctly so the cable has a fair chance of working? Beginners should also understand what a crimper does not prove by itself. If you attach a connector neatly, that does not automatically mean the finished cable is good. A cable can still be wired incorrectly, have poor internal contact, or have damage somewhere farther back in the jacket. That is why the crimper is mainly a construction or repair tool, not a final proof tool. A technician uses it when the issue is likely at the cable end or when a cable has to be made to length for a certain job. The thinking is very practical. If the user has an obviously damaged connector, a broken locking tab, exposed conductors, or a cable that was never properly terminated, the crimper belongs in the conversation. But if the cable looks intact and the complaint is more about uncertain connectivity, the technician usually needs another tool as well, because building the cable and proving the cable are two different things. Cable testers are extremely important because they help answer one of the most basic questions in networking. Is this cable actually passing the signal the way it should? A tester is used after a cable has been made, repaired, or suspected of causing trouble. It helps verify continuity, correct wire pairing, and whether the conductors are reaching the other end properly. In beginner language, it tells you whether the cable is connected correctly from one end to the other instead of just looking correct from the outside. This is useful because many cable problems are invisible. The jacket may look fine, the connector may appear neatly attached, and the user may still have no usable connection because one wire is open, crossed, reversed, or poorly seated. A technician reaches for a tester when the goal is to confirm or eliminate the cable itself as the problem before blaming the network port, the switch, or the user device. A tester is especially helpful because it prevents beginners from making a very common mistake, which is assuming that a newly made cable must be good simply because it was made carefully. Good support work does not run on hope. It runs on checking the result. If the user says a new desk was installed, a cable was extended, or a port stopped working right after someone moved furniture, a tester becomes a strong choice because the cable path may have been bent, pulled, or re-terminated during that change. The real question the technician is asking is whether the physical path is sound enough to carry communication. If the tester shows the cable is bad, that immediately narrows the problem. If the tester shows the cable is good, the technician can stop wasting time on the cable and move their attention toward the port, the device, or the network service beyond it. Loopback plugs sound more complex than they really are, but the beginner version is simple and useful. A loopback plug is used to test whether a network interface or port can send and receive signals correctly by returning the signal back to the device. In other words, it creates a small closed path that lets the device talk out and then back into itself in a controlled way. That makes it useful when the technician wants to know whether the local port or network interface is functioning without depending on the full outside network. If a device cannot communicate with the network and the technician wants to separate a bad port from a bad cable or a bad switch path, a loopback plug can help narrow that down. The key question behind it is this: can this port or interface handle basic communication on its own, or is the failure already present before the signal ever leaves the device? This makes loopback plugs very different from cable testers, even though beginners sometimes mix them up. A cable tester checks the path through the cable. A loopback plug checks the behavior of the local interface by giving it a signal path that comes back to itself. If a cable test passes but the device still cannot communicate, the problem may not be in the cable at all. That is the kind of moment when loopback thinking becomes useful. The technician is trying to isolate the failure and ask whether the network interface itself is part of the problem. That is why loopback plugs are good for narrowing the issue to a smaller point on the path. They are not broad network troubleshooting tools for every problem. They are targeted tools used when the technician wants to remove the larger network from the question and focus on the local send and receive ability of the device or port being tested. A network tap is different from the other tools because it is less about building or verifying a cable and more about quietly observing traffic. A tap is placed in the path of communication so traffic can be monitored or captured without depending entirely on what the devices at each end choose to report. For beginners, the easiest way to understand a tap is that it gives the technician or analyst a better view of what is moving across the network line. That is helpful when the physical connection seems alive, but the behavior on that connection is confusing. A user might report strange slowdowns, repeated disconnects, unexpected traffic, or odd communication patterns that are not explained by a simple bad cable. In that kind of case, the question changes. The technician is no longer asking whether the wire is connected. The technician is asking what is actually traveling across this path and whether that traffic matches what should be happening. At the A+ level, you do not need to think of a tap as a tool you will use every day in a small support bag. It is more important to understand its purpose and why it exists. A tap is chosen when observation matters more than simple physical testing. If a crimper helps make the connection and a tester helps verify the cable path, the tap helps reveal what is happening once real communication begins to flow. That is why it is so useful in environments where traffic analysis matters, such as when troubleshooting unusual behavior or when security staff need a clear view of activity on a segment. For beginner support thinking, the value is in knowing that some tools are meant to build, some are meant to prove, and some are meant to observe. The tap belongs in that observation category, and that helps you remember when it makes sense compared with the more hands-on cable tools. Another important beginner lesson is that a technician often uses these tools in sequence rather than as isolated choices. Imagine a user says a desk phone or wired desktop has no network connection after an office move. The technician might first inspect the cable and connector, then use a tester to verify whether that cable is actually good. If the connector is damaged, the technician may use a crimper to repair the end and then test again. If the cable proves good but the device still does not communicate, the technician may start thinking about the network interface or the switch port. In a more advanced case, if the physical path is known to be good but the traffic itself still seems wrong, a tap may help show what is really happening on the line. This sequence matters because it shows that support is often a process of removing doubt one step at a time instead of jumping straight to the most dramatic explanation. Beginners should also understand that tools do not replace thinking. A tester can show that a cable is wired correctly, but it does not guarantee that the wrong port was not used at the wall or the switch. A loopback plug can help prove an interface can send and receive locally, but it does not mean the upstream network is healthy. A tap can show you traffic, but it still takes judgment to understand whether that traffic explains the user's complaint. Even a crimper, which seems straightforward, can be misused if the technician chooses the wrong connector type or assumes any damaged cable should simply be re-terminated when the deeper issue is farther along the run. This is why tools should always be tied to a specific question. What exactly am I trying to confirm or eliminate? If that question is clear, the tool becomes useful. If the question is fuzzy, the tool can be used correctly and still not move the troubleshooting forward in a meaningful way. It is also worth remembering that users often describe physical network failures in ways that do not sound physical at all. They may say the internet is slow, the phone keeps dropping, the printer disappears, or the workstation goes offline every afternoon. A beginner might immediately think of service provider trouble, Wi-Fi issues, or software faults. But sometimes the simplest cause is still a weak cable termination, a damaged patch cable, or a network port that is not behaving correctly. That is why network tools are so valuable. They help bring the problem back down to something observable and testable. A technician does not have to argue with the user's wording. Instead, the technician can quietly ask whether the cable path is solid, whether the port responds correctly, or whether the traffic on the line looks normal. That habit turns vague complaints into smaller, more manageable checks that lead toward the real cause. A punch-down tool is another network tool beginners may hear about, and while it is not named in the title of this episode, it helps complete the picture of why different tools exist for different physical jobs. A punch-down tool is used when placing wires into certain connection points, such as patch panels or wall jacks, where the goal is to seat the conductors cleanly into the terminal instead of attaching a plug on the end of a flexible patch cable. This is useful because not every cable ends in the same kind of connector, and not every network cable job is solved with a crimper. The beginner lesson here is that network tools match connection style. If you are terminating a patch cable end, a crimper may matter. If you are seating wires into a structured wall connection, a punch-down tool becomes more relevant. That same thinking applies across all network tools. The choice depends on what part of the path you are working on and what kind of proof or physical change you are trying to achieve. The biggest shift from beginner to technician happens when you stop seeing tools as items to memorize and start seeing them as answers to practical questions. A crimper helps when the cable end needs to be built or repaired. A tester helps when you need proof that a cable path is good or bad. A loopback plug helps when you want to know whether the local interface can communicate without blaming the whole network first. A tap helps when you need visibility into the actual traffic moving across a link. Each tool fits a different stage of thinking, and that is why the same problem does not always call for the same item from the bag. The wrong tool is not always useless, but it often answers a different question than the one that matters most. Strong beginners learn to pause and ask what kind of evidence they need next, and then choose the tool that gives that evidence with the least wasted motion. The main takeaway from this lesson is that network tools are really about confirmation and elimination. They help the technician confirm a good cable, eliminate a bad connector, isolate a weak interface, or observe traffic that may explain strange behavior. That is what it means to use crimpers, testers, loopback plugs, and taps like a technician instead of like someone just trying random hardware. You are not reaching for a tool because the exam listed it. You are reaching for it because the user complaint has created a specific question that needs a trustworthy answer. Once you understand that, these tools become much easier to remember and much more useful in real support work. They are not random objects in a toolkit. They are ways to turn guesswork into evidence, and that is one of the most important habits any new technician can build.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.